Hello.
So I have called in Bob. I called in Bob too.
Well, he asked me to help him out. Thanks.
What about my other idea? What about my other idea?
Which other idea?
Absolutely right.
Okay. Can I come? Okay, good people. It's 10 a.m. Tuesday morning, 6-man working group. Eric and Fernando, please sit down. Thank you. Okay, welcome to the IP6 working group meeting here in Berlin. The co-chair that you've seen for the last 25 years, he decided to go sailing. So we have Bob too, that I've volunteered in here. Jan Zoritz, that you probably know, will help me out today. Should I just use this clicker?
Yes. The other side.
On the other side. Note well, you're aware of that. Michael Abrahamson is doing the Jabber Room. Stephen is doing minutes on Etherpad. If anyone wants to help out on Etherpad, please go in there and contribute to the minutes. Presentations are available on that URL for the remote participants. Michael, do you know if we have any remote participants at all?
Yes, we do.
Three people, right? Okay.
No, it's fine.
Good.
Yes.
Okay. And we have a big red button here to unmute them if they want to ask questions or make comments later. For the agenda, go through this introduction. We have 2 drafts on interface identifiers, one by Alyssa, which has been a working group last call for a long time. I'm proposing, for various reasons, to also move up a presentation by Fernando on non-stable IDs after Alyssa's presentation, so we do those in one bulk. Shout now if you object to that. Then we have a session on our most favorite topic, moving the base specifications to Internet standard. Tim Chown did some quite thorough reviews of the 3 documents. So he just now, so he just sent us some slides a few minutes ago. So he'll also share that slot with me, and hopefully we will be able to close most of the open issues that have been circling around the mailing list for the last few months. Then we have Brian and Brian doing a presentation on the special purpose address registry and the use of the term global, which was a bit ambiguous, moving Fernando's presentation upwards, and then we'll end with a presentation by Jen on the enterprise multi-homing draft. We have, any comments on the agenda, by the way?
Lee Howard, I don't think I've ever actually seen anybody comment on an agenda at an agenda bashing session. But so the agenda that's posted is not the actual agenda we're going to be using, right? Because the agenda, it's you've reordered the presentations.
There is one movement and one addition, yes.
Okay, so I will try to be keeping track, but that's going to be, please slow down for transitions so we can make sure we have the right documents and the right slides in front of us.
Yeah. Okay, so for document status, we have published no RFCs since the last IETF. We have no documents currently in the RFC editor queue. We have 3 documents at the ISG. It's the deprecate atom frag the obsolete MIBS document and the multi-homed host one, which I think just advanced to IETF last call. Suresh.
Yeah, so for the 3 documents, so the Atom Frag generation, it got like a couple of indirected reviews, and the authors posted like a draft like a couple of days ago. So for the new rev, so I'll send it over to last call soon. And the MIPS obsolete, I just want like a check from the ops ADs to like make sure that the way it's like doing is kosher, like make sure that's fine. And the multi-home host, I started the last call last week, and it's going to go on the telechat on the 4th of August.
Okay.
So that's the status for the 3.
Cool. Thank you. We have 5 documents in working group last call. We have the 3 BIS documents that we're going to talk about later. We have 6106 BIS that Fernando is shepherding, and we have the default IIDs document. Any comments on 6106 status there, Fernando?
Yes, just waiting for one of the authors to respond to whether they feel any IPR claims. So there were 2 that had not yet responded. There's one that's still missing, but other than that, is fine to ship.
Do you think you'll get hold of that author, or?
I keep sending the email, so I guess there's only one left to respond.
Okay. I don't know what the process is if we can not get hold of him. I guess we just have to remove him from the author list.
Brent's clarification question. Is it still in the last call, or is it out of last call?
6106?
Yes.
Yeah,
the author.
it is out of the last call as far as I'm concerned.
Will it go through IETF last call?
Pardon?
Will it go through IETF last call?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
I mean, it's...
So then it's in your interest to receive comments now.
right, but you know, we had to take that to the list, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Suresh Krishnan. So if you cannot get the approvals from the previous authors,
Can you go on the mic?
So the thing is, as far as I remember, there are 4 co-authors. 3 of them have already responded whether they have filled any IPR claims, but there's one that has not yet responded. So I'm just trying to get them to respond to that. I don't know what will be the process if that doesn't happen, but I mean, they should.
thank you. Can you please send a note to like Ole and me and Bob so we can try to follow up? Thanks.
Good. And the max array document, that's ready to be last called. So as soon as we finished with these 5 other documents, we'll last call that one. And we have 3 active working group documents, hop-by-hop header handling, RS refresh, and the segment routing header document. And that's it for document status. Any comments on that? Goals and milestones. As any working group, that's on the to-do list to update, but we're just the year behind, I think, so could have been worse. Okay, Alyssa, default interface IDs.
Yes, that's an improvement.
Yes. Okay. As you can see, back for more fun. So we had working group last call on this document, and there was a lot of discussion. So we took that into account and updated the document just before the deadline. So I wanted to go through what the changes are. Okay, so I think major point of discussion was around exactly in what cases do the recommendations in this document apply. So we have clarified in every location where it was necessary in the text that the recommendations apply only in cases where an IID otherwise would have been generated from a stable link layer address. So it no longer says link layer address, it says stable link layer address in all of those different places. And we took the text directly from Jinmei that had been recommended on the list and put that into the introduction. So that was a major set of changes. And then we also made it extremely clear that we're not touching anything to do with temporary addresses. We are not recommending that addresses be stable in cases where they aren't currently stable. None of those things. It's just an instant replacement in that limited scope of cases. So, right, so this is what I just said, that we're not touching 4941 and not recommending anything new about when to configure stable addresses. So the recommendation section previously, it had previously been very short, much like it is now. Then in the last round of edits before the prior IETF, we had expanded it to be more of a sort of principles-based, and it had more words, and that seemed to be causing confusion because it was sort of layering musts and shoulds to the point where it wasn't exactly clear what was required versus what was recommended. So we took out all the principle stuff again, so it now looks a lot more like it did before, and it just makes the sort of two baseline recommendations. Nodes should use 7217, and they should not use a stable link layer address in the IID. And that is like the essence of all of that this document does now. So the principles so the recommendation section is much shorter and clearer. And then finally, we updated all of the Section 6, which is the place where we do all the updates to the IPv6 over foo documents. So previously, the text in these sections said, basically it was just like a reference back to this document. And instead, we've taken those two core recommendations and just embedded them in each of these updates. So again, it's very clear. It's not some sort of guess you have to do between a concoction of must and should. It's just very clear what the should and should not recommendations are. And those are updates to that whole long list of documents listed in the update header. So that's the sum total of the changes. We think we addressed everything that came up in working group last call, and we're hoping to be able to proceed. Lorenzo, go ahead.
Okay. Lorenzo?
Yeah, Lorenzo Colletti. Instead of updating a million IPv6 over foo documents, can we just get over with saying nodes should use 7217 when generating then they would otherwise have generated link layer, an IID based on a stable link layer address. And the reason I say that is if we deprecate all that stuff, there's no recommended way to generate an IID. So right now it's totally unspecified. Right, as of now, the current state of the IPv6 specs, there is a known way of using of generating an IID on Ethernet or on whatever link layer. If we update these IPv6 over foo documents, that thing goes away. That known way goes away, and it's essentially unspecified. There's a should, and if you don't want to do that should because you wouldn't otherwise have used a stable link layer address, then you can do whatever you want. And so basically what this RFC says is, by the way, any IPv6 IID, if you don't want it to be stable, you can do whatever you want on any link layer. I'm not sure that that's even the intended goal here.
Go ahead.
Fernando, I don't know if I understood the question, but the reason for updating the IPv6 over foo documents is those are the documents that actually require to generate the addresses based on modified EU64. And in any case, 4291 has a description on how to generate the modified EU64 identifiers.
My bad. I was not clear. What I'm saying is that, yeah, I agree that this should formally update all these IPv6 over foo documents. It should say updates, blah, 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 because it actually overrides them. I agree on that. What I'm saying, though, is that we should not have these this boatload of text saying this text from RFC 2464 is hereby struck and replaced with this other text, if we can avoid it. Because all we need to do is formally update them, and then, yeah, this is what's going to take precedence over.
Well, in that respect, I fully agree with you. Actually, some initial version of this document was like that. Then we were asked to, include in the document which parts of which documents we were updating. It wasn't fun, but we did it because it was required. So, I mean, for me, it's okay. I mean, I think that the IPv6 over full documents need to be updated in the, in the metadata on top. I don't think that, the patches part is that useful myself. So for me, I mean, if the whole thing is about, removing that, for me, that's fine.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I thought you were suggesting that they not actually update the old RFCs, but okay. So yeah, I'm totally on board with that. And as he says, the original version of this was very short and simple and didn't have all these updates. We were asked to put in all of the specific text updates, so we did, but it's perfectly just as well to take them out if that's what people want to do.
So can I quickly comment on that? Because I think that came from Bob, right? And he's tried updating documents with updated by fields, and it's been incredibly hard to figure out what is it actually updates, right? Without a specific, here's the old text, here's the new text. Because it's, you kind of saying, well, it updates the spec, but it updates it in spirit rather than, exactly what does it change, and that's hard to figure out if it isn't explicit about it. So, this is, Bob wanted this because it makes our job a lot easier when we want to respin the RFCs. That's the cause of it. Dave.
Dave Taylor. So as another co-author on the spec, I don't feel strongly either way, but Ole just said what I was going to say. I think I was convinced by, I think it was Bob's argument that says it's a lot easier to figure out what parts what the relationship is. And so I thought it was fine to put stuff in. Again, I don't feel strongly either way, but I do believe he's probably right that it is clearer to have the text in there. And so unless there's something that is broken by keeping it in there, in other words, if there's unless there's disagreements in that text or whatever, it's easy to just leave it there because I think it does add to clarity. So.
Okay, I would just like to add. Can you please state clearly your name at the mic, because we have remote participants that need to know what's happening here and who's talking. Thank you.
Lorenzo Colidi. That was Dave Thaler. Lorenzo Colidi. So yeah, we can do that. It's going to be clearer, but then all the text, all these sort of this is replaced by that, they all need to be fixed to take into account the case where you're not generating an IID based on a stable link layer address, because this new draft now basically says if you're generating if you would have otherwise generated an IID based on a stable link layer address, here's what you should do. Okay, but then it guts a bunch of text that says here's what you should do. And so the case that it's leaving open now is that if this is published as is, we lose all guidance on what you should do if you're generating a link layer, an IID based on a link layer address that's not stable. So now we have to document, if we do want to document everything, now we have to say the text in 464 section blah is hereby replaced by this text that says do RFC 7217. Or if you're not using a stable link layer address, you can continue to use this old method. So we have to update all the updates. If we can go it this way.
Wait, one.
That was Dave Sandler. Yeah.
So yeah, Dave said he agrees to either remove it or make the changes. So, but is it sufficient to point to Appendix A of 4291 where this is specified? So we say, should use 7217, should not embed a stable link layer address. If you choose not to follow this guidance, then Appendix A of 4291 offers a method of how to do it.
If we're being explicit with what we update, then the text basically you're saying if we got text from 2464, will we default to whatever's written in 4291? I mean, that's kind of also that's kind of not meeting the spirit of what Bob would like to do.
No, I'm not saying default to it. I'm saying put explicit words in that point to 4291.
So are you saying that there's redundancy in the text of 4291 and 2464? If that's the case, then maybe we only need one of them. Okay, if the answer is yes, then we do still have to examine all the updated texts and make sure that they're still current. Okay. So it will have to be revved, and there's going to be the authors were going to have to do some amount of work to examine all the things that say this is replaced by that and consider this other case. Yeah, if it were me, I would just say, but.
So I will be perfectly fine with removing the patches.
You are?
Sorry, Fernando. I will be perfectly fine with removing the patches section. Now, if we were to keep that, then my take is that, if the advice is not actually is a should to not embed the link layer addresses, yeah. But even for non-stable, you don't need to mandate whatever we're doing nowadays. It's like if you're doing non-stable, you can do whatever you want. But
he's not asking for a mandate. He just wants it to be clear where it's specified how
Sounds good to
the
me.
method for doing this.
Then you need a section that says all default IID schemes are hereby deprecated, and generating link layer identifiers on all these links is up to whatever you want. Then you have to say it in the draft, and we have to have strong consensus on that, and people need to know that that's what we have consensus on.
Fernando again, for the non-stable addresses, that's why we publish the next document, which essentially says that, for non-stable, do whatever. But I think that's why it's split into different documents. This one is about the stable addresses. The other one essentially says, if you are doing non-stable, do whatever.
What if that second one doesn't gain consensus? We have a hole in the specs now. All right.
Who's next?
We're going to vote Suresh.
Suresh Krishnan. So I want to understand a little bit more of Lorenzo's concern. Okay, so 2464 only talks about the stable case. It doesn't talk about anything else. So exactly. Okay, so this updating this text, right? Like, so 2464 right now says like do whatever the hell, like if you're not going to do this, right? Like, so either you're not following 2464 at all if you do something else other than the MAC base address, right? Correct. Okay. So this one doesn't change any of that. Like, it's saying like if you're going to form, if you would have formed the address like the way 2464 asked you to do it this way. But it.
No, it's deleting the text for this draft deletes that text.
Lorenzo, can you say this to the mic? You can go to the mic in the back.
Okay. Lorenzo said this is deleting all the text in 2464. So if I understand your concern properly, you took something that's a must and you're replacing that with a should. Is that your concern? Is that what it's boiling down to?
My concern is that we're taking a must and replacing it with nothing. So implicitly, we're saying, do whatever you want. And I'm fine with that. So basically, I can write my own code, and whatever Android can say, I'm going to pick one all the time for an interface ID, all the time, one. And it's fine. I'm violating those standards track RFC. It's up to me. It's a dumb thing to do, but hey, it's fine, right? So I want to say that this working group should basically, with its eyes open, say IID generation is now unspecified in all these cases. If we want to say that, that's also fine by me, as long as we have consensus. I'm just saying we need to know what we're saying, because by.
Okay, I understand your concern, Alonso. Thank you.
Oh, come on, it's not.
But can I just say, like, I agree with Fernando. That was not really the point of this one. I don't think we intended to leave the alternative case unspecified, at least in my mind. What I thought we were doing was, in the alternative case, you still use what's in 4291. So that would be my preference as to what we say right now. That's what I think we actually have consensus around, if to the extent that we have consensus around anything.
But then that's not what Bob wanted, right? Then we're basically doing implicit stuff. We're basically saying, well, we're going to gut this text and it's going to update these RFCs. And you can't look at this new one and the old one. You have to look at the new one and the old one. And by the way, remember that actually 4291 says something.
But why can't we put pointers to 4291?
You can.
And
I'm
then,
just saying you have to change all the patches. That's fine. You can.
yeah, but it's not, this is not a hard thing to add one more sentence about 4291.
That's
So,
fine.
go ahead, Dave.
Dave there. This might help. Can we go back to the slide that had, not recommended and stuff at the bottom, the one that Alyssa you had that was the,
5 minutes.
I was looking for one that's the closest snapshot to this flavor of stuff that is what we're talking about.
The patch thing?
Yeah, the
This-
patch one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is one, if I understand Lorenzo's point, it's the entire text of 2464, right? He's saying, well, if you just remove all of that, then that's what you're saying, there's some hole or whatever, because now the should doesn't have an alternative because now you've removed the text that would have been the alternative, right? Is that my accurately reflecting your point?
Yeah.
Okay. I previously didn't have an opinion. Now my opinion, I agree with what Alyssa said a minute ago. But I'm fine if it actually does leave a hole. In other words, you said if we walk into it with our eyes open, we have consensus on that. And what I'm thinking about is that I don't think it's the job of this RFC, or I should say this amended RFC, meaning 2464 plus these patches or whatever, to say all possible things that you might do. So for example, link layer address randomization, right? There's a different document that talks about that and so on. It's not supposed to cover the entire space of everything, right? And so I'm fine with what it says right now, even though there's a hole there, because I'd say that would be my opinion, is to get consensus. But I also agree with Alyssa's comment that you just made a second ago about 4291. So that what my belief is that what we should do right now, my opinion would be just what Alyssa said.
And so just to be clear, since we have this text up here, my suggestion is something like we add one more sentence at the end of this that says, nodes that choose not to follow this guidance might use the mechanism specified in Appendix A of 4291.
Exactly.
Something like that.
Yep. That right. That I believe should be easy for us to get consensus on. My hope is that that should be relatively non-contentious because we kind of already have consensus on pointing to that particular thing anyway, because it's already an RFC from this group. And so I think that's the fastest way forward. So.
Brian Carpenter with a direct comment on that. I think it would be extremely bizarre to put a normative reference to RFC 4291.
Non-normative. Non-normative.
It's not normative?
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a document that's about to be overtaken by 4291 bis, which says something significantly different on this exact topic. So be very careful about that.
Sorry, is it obsoleting 4291? Sorry, I have no idea.
Yes, it is. Yeah, but you could reference 4291 bis, I think. So it has the UI.
But the way it works is that if you reference the original, then the bis is supposed to be a replacement in all cases anyway, right? So.
Is that a direct comment?
Sorry?
Is that a direct comment?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's take a step back. So right now we have like two different kinds of addresses, right? We have the stable addresses, the ones that have traditionally been generated with Slack, and we have the temporary addresses. This changes how we generate stable addresses. It has a shoot for that. If you don't want to follow the shoot, you have to specify something else. Now, when it comes to the non-stable addresses, the only thing that we have so far are the temporary addresses that are specified in 4941. So I don't see the hole there. If you are generating right now non-stable addresses, the only standardized way to generate that is 4941. You want to do non-stable, the only standardized way to do that is 4941. If you want to do stable, this is what you have to follow. This is the shoot. If you don't want to follow this shoot, well, you have to specify something else. So I don't see where the hole is here. That, specification hole that Lorenzo was referring to.
Tim is standing there for a long time.
Poor guy.
You missed the case where the link layer address is where it's generated directly from a link layer address that's not stable. You did not cover that case in what you said just now. But you're saying, so you're trying to generate non-stable addresses.
Yeah, I want to do UI64 and a random.
Well, current specs assume that the link layer addresses are stable. So current Slack is for stable addresses.
Can I? Okay. So, Suresh Krishnan. So the part that Lorenzo was talking about, that I was also going to talk about, is the random MAC addresses. So you're talking about embedding a stable link layer address. So if I understand correctly, like Lorenzo's missing case is embedding a non-stable link layer address to form an address like you would have formed in 2464. That's the case that's missing.
Yes, and so I think where the discrepancy is maybe is that Lorenzo is saying that because 2464 and 4291 don't presume anything about the stability of the link layer address. They say nothing. I'm assuming they say nothing about the link layer address being stable, because why would you have said that at the time? You could assume that they cover the case of non-stable link layer addresses, whereas Fernando, I think, is saying that his assumption is that they only cover the case of stable link layer addresses, and therefore we're not actually getting rid of anything that is relevant to Lorenzo's case. So that's, I think, where the difference of opinion is. But again, like, I don't see the downside of just non-normatively pointing to the place where people want to understand how to construct something from a link layer address, if that would make anybody happier.
Suresh Krishnan again. So I think, okay, so there's like a subtle point here in 2464, right? 2464 does not talk about stable or non-stable. It just says, this is your MAC address, this is how we form the EUI64 or modify the EUI64 out of it. It makes no pretense about like whether it's like stable or not. So if you leave 2464 as is, right? If your MAC address changes, you get a modified UI64 corresponds to that. Now you're saying like you're updating the stable part of it, but not the non-stable part of it. So that's still a gap. Like no matter like, I don't see a graceful way out of this. Like I like what you suggested, but I fully understand Lorenzo's point. Please.
Any direct responses, or we go to Tim's question? Okay.
Okay, so Tim Chang, yeah, so I agree with what was just said there. I think we also need to be careful about what text we're saying on this in 4291 bis itself, because there's a section there that talks about this privacy addresses and the fact that the old style has been moved to the appendix. And I think the words there, you need to check those. The other question I was going to ask, and maybe we don't want to start it now, is there's nothing in here that states anything about if you're using privacy addresses as to whether you can have only privacy addresses. Should we be saying that, or is that out of scope for this
Out of scope.
document?
That is out of scope
Okay, thanks.
for a different document. Yeah.
So Lorenzo Colidi, in case it helps, I just want to say there are actually two holes here. So one
I'm sure it's
hole-
going to help.
so in the text that's
Add
written,
another 5 minutes
and
there.
the text that's written, like one of the holes is, if we publish this as is, I can write code that says picks a random number between 1 and 16, and that's my IID, and it violates no RFC, even though it's a stupendously dumb thing to do, right? So it would be nice if we didn't, like, if our guidance.
Just to say, this document doesn't change that. You could do, if we never publish this document, that's still true.
No, because if I do it on Ethernet, then there's an RFC, standard track RFC, that says, here's how you do it, right? So
The default way of doing it, you can do
The
it
default
2 to
way
the
of doing
64
it.
minus 1 other way.
is that what it says, default? Is 2464 says this is a default IID? Yes. Okay. Okay, I guess maybe there already is that hole. And then also another thing that I think has not been said so far is that this particular text as is goes way beyond what the actual document says. This, to me, I read this text as an implementation of the earlier part in the document. This is how I perceive this text. So there's an earlier part of the document that says these recommendations apply in the case of blah blah blah, right? I see this text as being intended as an implementation of that earlier text in the document. However, this text goes way beyond that, because what it says is, we say, if you were going to use if you were going to base a stable, an IID on a stable link layer address, then do this stuff. Now this text updates 2464 saying you should do 7217. So there's a recommendation of doing 7217, and this recommendation is in no way qualified by if you would otherwise have generated a stable link layer, a stable IID. So we should add to this text, if we're basing, you see what I mean? So the text as is updates another RFC, and so that text becomes part of that RFC, and it loses the qualifier that we had in the beginning of this RFC, which is actually the intent. So that's kind of Byzantine.
I think, so just to make sure I understand, because if all we ever had was 2464, the assumption there is that those addresses come from a stable link layer address. And so by putting this in, we actually, I don't think I actually.
No, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So
I can't see what you're saying.
What I'm saying is this document says, do you want to, like, maybe?
Yeah,
So go
can you
ahead,
try it?
clarify what it says.
So just a second. In interest of time, we need to wrap it up slowly. There is still time. So whoever wants to comment or say anything, can you please come to the mic, because we would like to close the lines after that.
Dave Thaler, I'm going to clarify what Lorenzo said in another way. He's saying the should at the top would be better phrased with an if statement in front of it that made it clear that this is not trying to change how you might do something like 4291. Right now, you could read the first sentence as something that overrides as well. You shouldn't do 4291. The should is you should do it this way.
Yeah.
That's what he's reacting to. And as if there was an if that says if you are going to generate a stable address rather than a temporary address, then this should apply. So that's what Lorenzo's point is, and I think that resonates with me, because yes, I could read that first sentence as saying you should not do 4291, and that is not the intent. And so I agree that would be better phrased with an if.
Yeah,
Okay,
we
but
basically cut and
this is
pasted.
consistent with your position that there are people who have implemented 2464 using a non-stable link layer address, and they're compliant with 2464.
Maybe, but the point that I was reflecting off of Lorenzo here was having nothing to do with the link layer address. This is just whether you are doing a temporary address, that the first should in here is not overriding to say you should not do a temporary address, right? Because this could be read as saying you should not do temporary addresses.
But
I think
but I
basically-
guess my question is, if that's true, then couldn't 2464 be read that way right now?
So
Okay,
all I'm
okay,
saying
okay.
is to
I
propose,
understand.
here's a proposal.
Okay,
Is to make it clear what I'm saying. In this text, we should put the same if that we put in the earlier in the
Yep.
draft that says, if you were going to generate something based on a stable link address, then you should use 7217.
okay. Okay, I
And then it will
understand.
be,
Can we
once we do
proceed?
that, it'll be very clear that there's a giant hole in here, and then we can fix it.
Can-
But we should have that.
Fernando, I'm fine with the proposal made by Lorenzo, but the more we talk about it, I think this thing of having the patches in the document shouldn't be there. You go back to the time where
That is the simplest way.
we didn't have this section. I mean, just have the update metadata, and that's it. I think that, the more we shuffle this, it's like we are like going around for stuff that doesn't make much sense.
Pascal Tubert, just to say that Lorenzo's case is not at all a theoretical case. It's actually completely out there. In 6LoWPAN, we have a 8-byte MAC address. It's just too big to be used on the network. So what happens is when you join the network, you obtain a 2 bytes short address, which is dynamically assigned to you. So it's not, in my view, a stable address unless you stay there for life. I don't know. But it can be renewed. I mean, it's something dynamic. And 6LoWPAN tells you how you form a 48-bit address out of that, and then UI624 based on 2464. So at the end of the day, we follow 2464 through the creation of several steps. So we have this non-stable address. We are going through 2464, and we need to understand if we need to change anything in what we are doing today. And we are in this gigantic hole that Lorenzo is mentioning here.
Well, you can use 4291 bis appendix B, right? Which specifies how to generate modified UI64 addresses, I think.
I'm just saying, this document covered 6LoWPAN until a few days ago, and now it's not covering 6LoWPAN. So just, we are in the whole.
The line is closed.
If you want to play the exercise of how that works for us and what's a good idea for 6LoWPAN, I'm interested in working with you to see if you want to have a recommendation for us.
Okay, thanks.
Hello, this is Alex Petrescu. Whatever gets decided here about updating or not updating RFC 2464 or other IPv6 over foo documents, what is also important is advice to new IPv6 over foo documents. What are we going to put there in their interface identifier section? This text, other texts. So we are looking to 6 months to have a suggestion to new IPv6 over foo documents.
This text, whatever it is that we agree to,
Yeah.
I think is what we would hope for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The second comment, and I will stop after it, is that we seem to be discussing a lot RFC 2464, but we seem to forget the age of this document. It is relatively old. The problems that we try to solve, the interface identifier, random, not random, privacy, no privacy, are typically more of a wireless nature. RFC 2464 is not a wireless document, it is a wired document. It is not used on Wi-Fi. What gets communicated on Wi-Fi is not RFC 2464. What you can think that may be used on Wi-Fi is what happens inside the computer, not what gets on the wire, okay? So if you look at the frame format of RFC 2464, is not what gets on the wire. This is why I'm saying that maybe an update to RFC 2464 or a new document altogether may be needed. And at that point, we look at interface ID advice for random numbers and privacy and so on. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. So I think we need a little bit of clarity on a few things. You know, patches, no patches being the main one.
So this is certainly done in the context that we expect to move, you know, we were looking at moving 2464 to internet standard. And so we need, you know, keep that in the back of our heads. How would you possibly write that document? Which is the reason for the patches, right? But we can certainly try to do that discussion. We should probably have Bob involved in that one. But from what I heard, if Lorenzo and Dave came up with a sentence starting with if, we did a new revision and we did a short working group last call. I mean, we're not too far away from something we could agree on with that.
Can we do a hum that just says people that would prefer to remove this text versus modify the text? That would help the authors, I think.
Yeah.
That would not be very involved. I guess he's not in the room.
It's okay. He can express his
Right.
opinion
So
later.
phrase that question again, Dave.
As an author, I'd like to know what to do. I've heard people arguing it would be a lot easier if we removed the text in question, and other people arguing it would be a lot better if we would change this text in question. And some people saying, yeah, one of the two of those, and I don't care which. And as an author, I would like to know which of those two approaches to take.
And the question is about all of the patches, right? So there's patches to this list of 15
Correct.
documents.
Correct. People like Fernando and Brian and folks were arguing it would just be better to just remove those, and that was one of the options that Lorenzo said. So I said I would be fine with that. And other people said, well, we can bike shed all these things to figure out whether the way to wordsmith it and so on, and we can do that too. But we can only do one of those two things. I don't know which way to go.
So two approaches: either it updates all the IP602 documents and it implies what the changes are, and we'll figure out when we do the BIS documents of 2464, you know, we then distill what the changes are into that document, or we do the full diff set as it's in now. Okay, are people ready to hum for that? So who are fine with removing the patches, doing an implied update?
Hum, if you understand the question, please.
So,
it should be easy. If everyone understands the question, it should be very quick.
Or perhaps I should just ask one question then. Please hum if you think we should change the document to remove the patches and only have, you know, an implied update. And raise your hand now if you don't understand that question. Okay.
Raise hand if you understood the question.
Yeah. So, right.
We can't hear you.
Michael Abramson. So I think people need two suggestions written down, analyzed, and say yes and no. I can't. I will not hum for either of those because I don't understand the implication. I think most people in here can't either.
So, but just to be clear, there's a section in the document. There's section 6 in the document. So the question is, should we take section 6 out?
Exactly.
If you want to take section 6 out, then we'd like to hear about it. And if you don't want to take section 6 out, then we'd like to hear about it.
Yeah.
Right. I agree. That was what I was saying. That is the question.
Yeah.
Should we remove section 6? Yes or no?
Yeah. Yep. And okay, so please hum if you think it's okay that we remove section 6. So please hum first. Okay, and please hum if you think we should keep section 6. Okay, it's an preference to remove it, but it's clearly a significant minority here who think it could be there as well. I think we have to take it to the list to confirm. Suresh, last comment, please.
Yeah, Suresh Krishnan. So, like the people who hum don't remove it. Can you state like why you did that?
Oh boy, no.
Yes. Yeah. I will mention that the questions were both phrased as shoulds or okays rather than do you object to this going forward, which was Pete's suggestion. And so I suspect that's why you got the answers, but I don't think the answers would change if you phrased it the other way. At least that's my interpretation, is that the direction I got as an author is we're just going to move section 6. Thank you.
So anybody who has an objection, send something to the list and when you confirm this consensus.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Elisa. You got us almost back on track. Fernando, could you please do non-stable IPv6 interface identifiers?
You can advance by yourself and stand in here so people can hear you.
So this is Fernando Gon presenting the document advice on non-stable IPv6 interface identifiers. As a kind of motivation, while we were discussing the previous ID, there was discussion about whether it was possible to use only temporary addresses, okay? So Lorenzo was arguing that, there are scenarios in which I would like to use temporary only addresses or non-stable addresses only. Now, right now, what we have is for temporary addresses, 4941, that's the only thing that we have, but 4941 implicitly requires you to also have a stable address, okay? So right now, you cannot really, if you are compliant with the standards, you cannot do temporary only. You have to do stable and temporary. So essentially what this document tries to do is to update 4941, minor, other details, to actually allow you to be able to do temporary only. If you are, for example, in a scenario in which you have a mobile device or whatever, for which, privacy is very, very important, you might want to not have a stable address, just have a temporary address, and that's the sole goal of this document. What does this document do? So one of the things, it clarifies that, if you are a host, you don't need to configure a stable address. So it's not required to have a stable address. It formally updates 4941 so that a stable address is not required. And then it does two extra things, specify requirements for these non-stable IIDs, essentially that they are not predictable, obviously. I mean, it's just, it's like a long way or like a long way to say that, these identifiers should not be predictable. And it suggests possible ways in which you could possibly generate those interface identifiers. What's the update to 4941? Essentially is that you may generate a stable address, but you are not required to. So with this update, you can do, if you want, like just stable, stable plus temporary, or just temporary only, okay? When it comes to the requirements, this is essentially taken from the other documents that we were working on. Essentially, if you have different prefixes, the interface identifier should be different so that you cannot correlate between the two addresses. They must be semantically opaque. They should not be predictable, and so on and so on. And when it comes to, you are going to complain about bullet 3, right? Okay, good.
I was going to suggest, if it's not already covered by the bottom bullet on slide 5, if you go back one slide.
Yes.
It must be difficult to predict. It should also make sure that in terms of listening requirements, it is difficult to predict the next one given the current one.
Yes. Well, I think that, off the top of my head, in the document, that's made clear, but I just tried to summarize this.
Okay,
in the.
that's what I want to make sure.
Yeah.
Just make sure it's clear in the document. As long as it is, then great. That was my
Yeah. And when it comes to possible ways to generate them, it essentially says, do whatever you want. If you just want to pick a random number, that's fine. Two other possible ways to do it is, one is to do 4941, the same algorithm, just without generating the stable address. The other way is like whenever you attach to a network, you just generate a random number, and that's what you put in the interface identifier. That's it. This is just two options, but we are not recommending you to use any of this. It's just do whatever you want. Yes.
Okay, Suresh Krishnan. So in 4941, I'm trying to understand what you're trying to formally update in 4941, right? So 4941 doesn't require you to do something else. It just states as a matter of fact that it has been done before. So when 4941 was done, right, one of the things was like people said like, don't mess with what's in whatever became 4862, okay? So what 4941 states is like, we're not changing anything that 4862 is asking you to do, okay? It doesn't say, there's nothing in there which says like, you must do like a stable address before you do this. So correct. So because it says I'm formally updating 4941, I want to figure out what exactly is formally updating in 4941, right? So right now, the way I remember it is like 4941 says, do whatever you would do using 4862 or like 2462 became 4862, then says form additional addresses. I think the word you're like hung upon is additional, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so I think that you need to be clear what you're updating, because like right now, there's no requirement to do stable addresses in 4941.
But when you say generate the temporary addresses in addition, I mean, in addition means that you have the temporary, that you have a stable address.
Right. So when 4941 was done, right, the consensus of the group was don't mess with 4862. Okay.
So you're correct in that was the intent, Lorenzo Colidi. Yes, the intent of 4941 was just to generate stable addresses. The actual text depends in many ways on the existence of an actual non-privacy address. For example, it says things like, if this array would have increased the lifetime of your stable address, then blah, blah, blah. So if you just take out that text, then you never refresh your lifetime. So that sort of implementation detail needs to be clarified, I think. So in many ways, it does depend. So I think it's correct to update it. I had something else to say as well, which is by default, by the way, by default, RC 4941 does not meet your criteria.
Is what?
4941 by default does not meet your criteria. It violates point 2 of the previous slide, I think. Sorry, no, it violates point 1. By default, it does not generate stuff that's different for different prefixes. So you'll probably have to update that as well.
So you mean that you can use the same interface identifier for different prefixes?
It says that by default you do that.
That's not nice.
Yeah, Brian Carpenter, I want to back up this point. I mean, everybody has read 4941 as saying this is in addition to your stable address. When you try to switch off your stable address, at least on my Windows 7 box, you can't, it keeps coming back, right? So I actually had to write a script that ran in the background which deleted the stable address each time it came back in order to run my tests of living without a stable address. So there's a very strong presumption everywhere in practice that there is a stable address as well. So I think you need to be very explicit in changing that assumption. Whether that's a normative update to 4941 or not, I'm not quite sure, but it needs to be very clearly stated that that assumption has to go for this to make any sense. But on the other hand, the comment I really wanted to make was that there's something of the opposite aspect which is missing from your draft. You don't give any kind of warnings about the implications of not having a stable address. And I think it would be wise to include at least a paragraph in the introduction saying, be aware that running without a stable address may have the following unintended side effects that you will not enjoy.
I agree with that, yeah.
Dave Taylor. I had an email conversation with Fernando in preparation for this IETF, and I'll just relay what I said in there because my reading of 49 to 41 was different than Fernando's and perhaps everybody else's, I don't know. But this was in the context of that word additional that somebody quoted before. I said, well, 4941 was not trying to modify anything else, whether you had stable addresses or not. So it's in addition to 0 or more stable addresses that you have. The 0 or more versus 1 or more interpretation is up to the reader, right? Fernando had the in addition to 1 or more interpretation, and I had the interpretation of in addition to 0 or more, right? Which meant that 4941 could already be used in isolation, but 4941 did not say whether you needed to have stable addresses or not. I think the other place that you mentioned, not additional, was, it's the one that somebody mentioned about the lifetime issue was another one that could be ambiguously read. And so I think that if you're looking at, you should, somebody made the statement that you should be clear as to exactly what you're updating. Those two sentences would be good to update, perhaps as I suggested, as I read them, to say additional if present and update if present, and just show the if present or if any or something clarification there. And so that would be a way to implement somebody's suggestion to say, show exactly what it is that you're updating.
Suresh Krishnan. So I agree with Dave, but I have a concern about like what Brian said, okay? So whatever you do to update 4941 is not going to take away Brian's problem, right? You cannot, 4941 is not the authority to say don't generate stable addresses. So that's not going to get fixed, okay? No matter what we do, okay?
Sorry, again.
4941 cannot say don't do something else, right?
Exactly.
Exactly. Okay, so that's not going to get fixed. So I think personally, my feeling, no AD hat, but with the 4941 co-author hat on is to BIS it. If like Lorenzo's point is valid, right? So we BIS it, we need to fix it because the update, like to do other things, may or may not work with the right intended consequences. But I'm willing to have that discussion over there. But I think this goes more than like the issues that is in 4941, because let's say we read like the ambiguous like text. Dave said ambiguous. Like for me, it says additional. I understand that, but that was by design at the time. So if like working group consensus has changed to say don't say additional and make sure that like the lifetime validation is not like based on presence of a stable address, we BIS it, we fix it, right? Because there's also an errata that came in, okay, which is to be evaluated. Somebody says like, okay, like the point number 4. Somebody's done research which says like it's easier to predict this thing, okay? So we should BIS it, look at the errata, and then see if we get consensus on the new thing. That's just my 2 cents. No AD hat.
One thing that this document does, besides the clarification that you're not required to generate a stable address, is essentially open the door to allow you to do to generate the non-stable addresses in any other way. For example, 4941 uses an algorithm with a history and blah, blah, blah. So for example, my question, if I was trying to implement some sort of non-stable address, is why I should use that algorithm as opposed to just generate a random number, for example.
I understand, right? And
so this just leaves the door open. Like, one thing, you don't need to configure stable addresses, but also, I mean, there are like different possible ways to actually, generate the non-stable addresses.
Correct, right. So 4941 describes one way of generating temporary addresses. Nobody's forced to use that, right? So like the problem you state does not exist because like nobody's forced to use 4941. 4941 exists because Dave decided he's going to put it in Windows and it's getting generated. There's no other specification that says you must do 4941, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so we need to separate these 2 parts out. Like you're saying, like I want to do temporary addresses some other way, sure, right? Because it's like CGS, like it's not temporary, but it does like another form of random addressing, right? Like based on your public key, right? So there's already existence proof of things that are not, they're like based on random stuff, but they're not 4941. So I don't think it needs to be said anywhere. So for me, as I said, like my view is like be 4941 BIS.
5 minutes. Okay.
Okay, in interest of time, we need to slowly move on.
I'm reacting to your third bullet here, not embed layer 2 address. So small reminder that the way 6LoWPAN works is that we can compress the global address in the packets because they are derived from the temporary MAC address, which is assigned by the network. So we effectively get a result which was expected from this old DHCP transient addresses because we have a transient MAC address and we derive the global address from the transient MAC address. If you bar this, well, obviously you will not be followed by 6LoWPAN because that's just the way it works already.
Do you use non-stable addresses in 6LoWPAN?
We have non-stable layer 2 MAC addresses which are assigned by the network, so they are very short. And we build the global address based on that so that we can compress the layer 3 address. So we effectively derive the non-stable IID from a non-stable layer 2 address.
So let's say this. I could live with removing bullet 3. I think it's an extremely bad idea to include a link layer address in the IPv6 address for so many different reasons.
You have to document why it's a bad and well,
yeah.
And where it applies, because the whole problem we have with the shoulds is we never know why the should is a should, and if really that we can live with the.
Yeah, I'm fine with removing bullet 3. I don't think embedding the address is a good idea, but I'm fine with removing bullet 3 if that's. Yeah. Well.
What we did in the other document that Alyssa just presented is you added the word stable in front of like link local addresses. This is just saying you can do the same thing with bullet 3, must not embed stable layer 2 addresses, which is doing the same thing for the link layer address. That would be another way of accomplishing this that leaves bullet 3.
Okay, the queue is closed now.
Carrie Lynn. I just want to follow on to the points that Pascal's making about 6LoWPAN and say that there are now about half a dozen 6Low standards that all use the same addressing approach. It's important, particularly that bullet 3 not be enforced for link local IIDs, because you for these very constrained devices, you need some sort of a bootstrap address that you can use, for example, to talk. Maybe DHCP gives you your privacy address or something like that. So I think a distinction, look, that's fine, but I think it should say stable layer 2 addresses, you know, if you're gonna retain it, and I think that it should apply, you know, to forwardable addresses.
I'd say that in the hopes of, let's say, saving energy, I would be fine with removing bullet 3, because some of these discussions we have had, like, you know, forever. So I'm fine with removing bullet 3. I still don't think it's a good idea, but it's okay.
Done.
So what should be the...
You had one more slide, right? I have no idea how to turn this off now.
This technology.
So I think we should continue the discussion on the list and get a little bit more meat on the bone, especially I think, you know, considerations about what's the consequences of having, you know, only, yeah, and then we'll, you know, gather momentum there. Okay, cool. I think Tim is next. Yeah.
Can you use the mic?
So now we're going to do a couple of sessions on these 3 BIS documents to go through working group last call comments. Tim has one session. I have one as a stand-in for Bob.
I just emailed you.
Yes, this one. Oh,
You just emailed something new?
Yeah, since the session started.
it's complicated.
That doesn't quite
It's purely because I had a fart and put 2.4 instead of 4.2. So that's
Yeah, well, we can live with that. I
RFC
think.
overload. Okay, so just globally substitute and replace 2. Well, actually, don't do that. That could be dangerous. So. Okay, so Ule asked some people to do reviews of these 3 documents previously, so I sent some to the list. There's quite a range of comments, and it's not totally clear to me as to which are in scope for an update as you move to IS, as to whether there's too much change or how much change you can actually have. It's worth throwing this up, though, that in terms of the criteria for Internet Standard 6410, you need to show a few things, like there's a generally held belief that the specified protocol or service provides significant benefit to the community, which hopefully IPv6 does. But also here 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I think when we come on to look at 1981 BIS, then point 1 there might be a little bit contentious in terms of successful operational experience, so just bear that in mind.
What about no unused features?
Well, it's that's what it says in 6410. Okay, so here's a few points on the comments I sent in about did I say 2460. So just come up to the mic as we go through these, I guess, and then the chairs will decide how much time we've got. One of the general points I have is all 3 of the updates, they make updates based on previously published RFCs or RFCs published since 2460, and it's not consistent as to whether you then cite those RFCs or not. So in some cases they are cited, in some cases they aren't. We should probably be consistent. My feeling is we should cite the RFCs that have documented these changes so that people can easily find them and look at them.
So Tim, one comment on that. Would it be okay to do that in the the appendix, the changes appendix, where it says, incorporated changes from?
Yeah, so
RFC?
some of those citations are included in the change log, but
Right.
not in the text. My open question is, for the point of view of a reader coming and just reading the main document, should you have the citation in it or not? At the moment, it's inconsistent. So I don't mind. My preference is to include, but we should be consistent.
My question.
I'm not sure if you want us to react to these points
Name?
right now. Michael Richardson.
Yeah, as we go through,
Yeah.
just come to the mic.
So as we go through, you mean you have subsequent slides
Yeah, there's one slide per update.
comment? Okay, well, I'll just wait for that then.
So each bullet point here, come to the mic. There are 3 slides in this talk, 1 for each of the RFCs that's being updated.
Oh, okay, so this is the right time to talk to this bullet, all right. So I've said before about PM2D, I actually think that PMTUD should be
No.
strongly not
Wait till I
recommended.
get through to that.
Yeah,
Let me try and explain again.
Okay.
There is one slide per update. There are a number of bullet points. As we go through each bullet point, come up to the mic for that bullet point. Don't jump ahead on the bullet points.
Okay.
Is that okay? Fred, is that reasonable? I don't know. Okay, so if you've got anything to say about the citations, come now, otherwise we'll go through. The second one is that there has been some discussion on the list about the meaning of the word process or examine, because in principle you can't examine without processing. Do we need to be clearer about that? The default is to leave it as is if we're happy with that. There was a point I think you made on the email overnight, which is the next one, which is the contradictory text with respect to 7045. Currently in 2460, it talks about discarding if you don't recognize the specific options, whereas in 7045, it's saying the default should be to allow it through. So I think I agree with it. I think it was your text, wasn't it? I think I agree with that. I don't know whether anyone else has any comments on that, but it would seem we should make 2460 align with 7045 and not be at odds with it. Brian?
Yeah, Brian Carpenter, co-author of 7045. So we got feedback on the statement in 7045, which people had probably never looked at when that was a draft, that it was too complacent. It just said, well, you know, we know that some routers will ignore hop-by-hop options, and that's all right, right? And the reason for the text in 2460 bis was because people didn't like that. They thought that was too weak and pragmatic a statement. So if you change that back to what 7045 says, which is basically shrug, right? We know that some routers will ignore hop-by-hop options, it doesn't matter. That goes against some of the other feedback we got earlier in this process. I didn't have enough time to go back in the archive and find it, but there was quite a bit of backwards and forwards on that before the text current in 2460 bis.
So I don't have a strong view. It's just a matter of being consistent, I think, or
Well,
knowing that
the
we're being
intention-
inconsistent
The
deliberately.
intention was to be inconsistent with 7045.
So I have a separate slide because that is in the issue tracker that we'll go through afterwards.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's have that discussion afterwards.
Yeah, yeah. So
We should have
it's you know, your recommendation goes against some opinions that were quite strongly expressed a couple of months ago.
So I was just reviewing against this version, therefore I hadn't tracked that that had happened. The next one, and again this may be the same thing, is that RH0 was removed from the full implementation list of extension headers, but there are other routing header types that are at least defined and in use, certainly for RPL, for example. So should we have RH in that list or not? Has that discussion happened? Have we just taken out RH type 0 because that's deprecated without thinking about other routing headers or types? Fred?
I don't think it actually, this is Fred Baker. I don't think it makes sense to put the routing header into the full implementation list because the different headers are different. They're violently different from each other. What is the same is that they're in a certain place. So if you're going to add the routing header to the full implementation list, I think you have to say which instances of the routing header are required in a full implementation.
Yeah, so originally it said, I think, just type 0, because obviously 2 and 3 I don't think were there at the time. And we also
we've
do
effectively excluded RH0.
Yeah.
I mean, we've said don't do that.
Yeah, that's mentioned as deprecated somewhere else in the document. So that's just an open question on that. And also later on in 2460 bis, it talks about the expected order, and routing header is mentioned in the order, and it's the only one mentioned in the order that isn't, I think, in the full implementation list, which is a little odd, maybe.
Well, once again, okay, I might or might not find something in that location, but so as an implementer, if I'm going to say, you know, the thing says thou shalt implement the routing header, what do I implement? I think I need to know because they are active.
Well, previously it said routing header brackets type 0. It could say brackets type 2 or 3 or whatever.
But I think Fred's point is that it's impossible to implement the routing header without having an actual type to implement.
And you wouldn't necessarily want an RPL header in a generic implementation, but just so we're aware of that. Any other comments to that, or?
It's a mic in the front and then mic in the back.
So I went here because I have a comment on that. So that's definitely true for a router. But for a host, we have this other, so Eric Nordmark, for a host, we have this other behavior, which is just checking segments left equals 0. And if it's not, then I think a host just drops the packet, right, or something. But that's a behavior that's common independent of type of routing header. It only applies to hosts. So that one we can say is part of the whatever, full implementation thing for hosts. Agree about routers, yeah, it doesn't make sense to have a generic statement.
Well, I think that's a good
and
point.
then a nit comment on that, saying that only applies to hosts. It also applies to a router when the router is acting as a host. So.
Okay, the next one was whether we should add a note in the part about fragmentation as to the RFC on not fragmenting neighbor discovery messages. I have no strong view either way on that. Obviously, nobody else has a strong view, so the default will be not to add the note. It's,
Yes, please. No good can ever come of that. I mean, it's just bad.
what was the? Be clear which way you're
Lorenzo
saying.
clearly, yes, let's say that we shouldn't fragment ND because all that's going to do is introduce security vulnerabilities. Has been like IPv4 fragmentation has been the gift that keeps on giving security vulnerabilities. Let's just not do it in ND, which is critical.
Yeah. Suresh Krishnan, so I don't agree. Why should 2460 bis talk about it? That's related to 4861.
Yeah.
Right? Like it shouldn't be here.
That's my view. It's important, but as Lorenzo says, but whether it's appropriate here is the question. So I guess we leave it out from what you've said. Another one, interesting one, I've not really come across it or thought about it too much, but there is in the 2460 a 60-second rule about reassembling fragments. That seems to be a very, very large value today. And do we really use 60 seconds or should we bring that down? Take it out, leave it? What do we do?
Make it 60 nanoseconds.
Oh. Don't make me test that. Tim Winters, UNHIOL. So the IPv6 ready stuff, we make them do the 60 seconds. What we found is almost all hosts do 60 seconds out of the box.
Okay.
The kernel's set that way, routers configure it. We've run into some hosts now that have started to tweak that value because they think 60 seconds is too long, but everything out in the world now does 60 seconds.
Okay, it does seem very long to me, but if that's what hosts are doing, we can leave it like that.
You'd be messing with every implementation out there if you want to change this value.
Thanks, that's really useful, whether we agree with it or not. There's also a little, in my mind, ambiguity about what's next header value 59. That was left out of 7045. Presumably we want to keep it in here, essentially the null headers. We will leave it in unless anyone says there's taking it out. Keep it, cool. Now we can get to Mike. So it says in 2460 PMTUD is strongly recommended, but makes no statement about PLP MTUD. In 1981 BIS, there is a paragraph that's been parachuted in about PLP MTUD. Is that 4821, I think? But that's not mentioned here. Should we mention it here or just leave that to 1981 or what? Mike?
Michael Richardson. I actually argue PMTU should be strongly not recommended. I think that it has been filtered to the extent that it is now effectively useless in V4. It's much better in V6 because most of the people that are too stupid to allow it don't support V6 at this point. So the life is much better, but they'll come, they'll arrive, and they'll arrive with and they'll do something stupid. And we will then be in the position of having no PMTU mechanism at all.
So the question is, what should we say in 2460 BIS?
We had better, I think we had better be recommending PLP MTUD. It should be on. We have a problem for not TCP processes, okay? Duh, well, duh, we have a problem. Guess what? We have a problem, okay? It's an open problem, and applications are, going to have to do something, and they're going to have to deal with packets disappearing because they sent them too big, okay? And they're going to have to deal with that right now, and they're doing it right now. So I think I just think you should delete their PMTUD path I think it's you're wasting transistors at this point. That's my opinion. Okay, I would love to have reliable things. I, do IPsec. I would love to make my tunnels the right size, and I have code to do that, and just doesn't work. Anyway.
Yeah. So there
I said on the list, people have I'm not going to say it 27,000 times. People have disagreed, but we haven't achieved, in my opinion, any clear consensus that one way or the other, right? No one has said, I cannot live if we do this. They just said, oh, but we blah, 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 blah. What about this? I'm like, well, I think we should do that.
Yeah. So again, coming back, noting this requirement about successful operational experience for IS standard.
Fred Baker, random opinion generator. So I think the filtering of PMTUD actually is quite often not an active filter against ICOM. There are those security people that do that, but quite commonly, I think it's a NAT. The NAT receives the ICOM message and has no idea where to send it, and it drops it. So if we don't have NATs in the path, that dynamic would be different.
It's not an app. It's right outside the banking website.
Okay, whatever. In any event, my fundamental question, the real reason I came to the mic, does IP implement PLP-MTUD? As far as I know, that's a TCP procedure.
Yeah.
Just a housekeeping note, Tim, this is your first content slide and still 15
I'm
minutes
relying
left.
on you to keep us on time. So if you say cut, and we'll move on.
Okay.
Suresh Krishnan. So I think one more thing we need to think about, like forget about like what Michael said and see if it's appropriate to do it when we're elevating this to standard, like to internet standard. So like this is stuff that's been implemented. We know that it, like the packets are sent out. Like when I say it works, it's like there, like Tim has tested it, right? And so if you want to say operationally it doesn't work, it probably like Fred will take up something in V6 ops, so she'll say like, don't do this, do that, right? But it's not appropriate for this document. That's my 2 cents.
I mean, the other way you could do that is just pointing to 1981 BIS and not being prescriptive here.
Jelenko, I actually think passing to discovery in V6 works a bit better than V4 because it's not unreachable message anymore. It's explicit error. So people who filter unreachables would not break passing to discovery. And from my experience, most of the problem with passing to discovery in V6 is because of rate limiting, not because of filtering. I think we should keep it.
Yeah, Dave Taylor, I agree with Suresh, Tim, and Jen. The cases for PMTUD right now are primarily intra-domain. I think all the problems that Mike was talking about are ones that, like if you're a cell phone directly connected to the internet, you have problems. But if you're using protocols other than TCP and you're using them across a home or a corporate network which doesn't have NATs, it's the solution. And so I think you should leave it as is.
Okay.
Mark Townsley, so you're on record that we can have a solution that works in a domain and differently than across the internet. That's cool. For the internet version, maybe we can fix PMTUD. Maybe we can actually try to get this to work.
Yeah, we certainly encourage work in that direction. It's not going to go in this document.
Fair.
Absolutely.
Okay, so moving on, and sort of Lorenzo hinted at this, I think, as well. The text currently on page 24 simply says fragmentation is discouraged. Certainly in the case where you've got the choice of either fragmenting or sending a couple of packets at 1280 MTU. Do you just want to leave it at discouraged? The default would be to just keep saying as it is. I know we had that big push with Ron's draft a few years ago, and nobody wanted to go really much further than that, but the question is open while we're updating this.
While people come to the mic, and before we're at the end of this, there's another slide after this, right?
One per, not for 2460. There's one slide per update.
So what happened with the extension header insertion?
We're going to, so I have a separate session on updates and changes in IETF and the issue tracker, so it will be discussed
Okay,
there.
thanks.
Fernando, regarding what's on page 24 about being discouraged, I would agree with that, but I guess that if you say it's discouraged, you should probably say why. not just discouraged. So if I was reading the document and say, okay, it's discouraged, why?
It says it has to be reassembled. And I think it's pretty clear sitting around for 60 seconds with half a packet is a reason to be discouraged.
Yes.
But I don't think we can say anything stronger because that would break interoperability, and that's certainly something we shouldn't do.
And that's where we went with Ron's discussion before. So. Yeah. Okay, let's move on in the interest of time.
So just a note, Tim. So the minute taker, I really hope writes down taking the actions here and what we agree on. And do you see yourself replying to your own review with the conclusions here?
Yes.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you.
But there are other more editorial comments in there as well. So.
Yeah.
Okay, so 1981 BIS, I think the sort of the headline here, and we've had it at the microphone a little bit, is whether we consider the successful operational experience, and the whole question, therefore, of moving it to internet standard on that basis is, we'll probably talk about that for 45 minutes, but that's a question that the chairs obviously have to consider. Probably don't have time to have a big fun fight about that now, but it needs to be considered. Again, the consistency of citations. Now, PLP MTUD is mentioned now in 1981 BIS, but it's only put in there as a paragraph in the introduction. The spirit of it, if you like, is not maintained through the document, where it only talks about PMTUD and talks about packetization layer issues without mentioning that. So we might want to make it consistent through the document rather than just having it as a one paragraph added at the start. Do we want to talk about this assumption that you can be using both potentially? So it doesn't say anywhere explicitly that you would use one or the other. Another thing throughout the document is that the section on implementation issues talks wholly about the node's perspective. It doesn't talk about what might happen on the path. So there is no mention, for example, of things like 4890 or how nodes might process the packets on the path. Do we want to add that? By default, we'll leave it as it is, I guess. But it is an issue in operational experience, at least. Default's leaving it as it is. This is good. Looks like we're not making many changes. Page 3, there's no text there on why a 1280 MTU may be beneficial, i.e. using 1280 rather than fragmenting. Perhaps we should add that. Anyone in favor of that? So how about we say we will add a little paragraph there as to why it's beneficial, just to counter, and that's something from operational experience since this was written.
I don't know if there's some text, Eric Nordmark, I don't know if there's some text we can borrow from the DNS side of things. I mean, the DNS servers, they run in this mode, right, where it's on 1280 because they don't want to build up path empty state. It's just a waste.
Okay.
Well, they certainly fragment as well, right? The servers fragment, they don't accept fragments, they fragment outbound packets.
No, the bind code sets the socket options to send 1280 byte packets. And then they might fragment to 1280, yes.
Yeah.
But they don't do PMTU discovery as a result of this.
Right.
But if there's text there that can be borrowed, I don't know if there's a document describing its behavior for DNS, we could use that.
Okay. Jeff
Houston, it's no longer clear anymore. It used to be a sound operational practice when you're doing UDP to set the MTU to 1280 and fragment. The problem is, as you've just published in some other RFC, the fragmentation extension headers is absolutely fatal to that. And what you see is as soon as you do that, the frags you send out get lost in the network. So it's actually operationally a risky and actually worse practice when you're doing UDP to set your MTU to 1280. And you get about a 30 to 40% loss rate if you're going to random destinations. Oddly enough, if you use 1500 MTU, the loss rate comes right down. So, the lies we tell ourselves is all about the fact that extension headers really work and, the network's clean. The reality is you've gone and fenced yourself in, and the use of a 1280 MTU is operationally riskier and actually more loss prone than using a 1500 MTU for UDP. So this whole thing about what MTU to recommend for UDP is by no means clear operationally in today's network. That shreds extension headers.
So should we say anything about that at all in this update, or just leave that for something else?
Well, what does it currently say? Use 1280?
It doesn't.
No.
Well, in that case, you should refrain from saying use 1280
Right,
because
okay.
that's a poor recommendation.
That was going to be my advice as well, is not to say anything about this, because if you do, everyone will drop their MTU to 1280, and then you're going to have a whole new slew of interesting problems.
Mark
Okay.
Andrews, ISC, the author of, one of the authors of Bind. NameD sets the MTU for both TCP and UDP at the moment to 1280. Most of the reason for that is that MTU discovery takes too long for both UDP and TCP. It really takes a long time for path MTU discovery to work.
So,
Well, DNS, you've got to resend the client's got to resend the query, and it's got to come back, go through the server, bounce off whichever tunnel entry point it is, come back. So the servers set the MTU to fragment at 1280. That gets through a lot of, it works some of the time. No. Basically, if the client fixes its own firewall, it works. It rarely fails. Fragmented traffic rarely fails coming back from the server. There are cases where it does. But basically, we should be saying to those vendors that have those pieces of shit, and yes, I am using that sort of language, that they should be removed from the internet. Replace them. I know there's a lot of them out there, Jeff, but they should be removed.
Say what you
We
really
love
think.
the energy.
Okay, I think we have to wrap. I think we have to wrap up this document
Yes.
because we're not going to have.
So I
Yeah,
think there's
let's move
potential. We won't add the line that was suggested there. There's potential. You've noticed the next to last point, there's a section on transport area, other transport protocols. Maybe in that section, there's a paragraph we could think about adding there, perhaps. Did you want to say something to this, or?
No, that was a different topic.
Okay. Lorenzo?
I think we can have consensus on that there's successful operational experience of PMTUD. I suppose that's supposed to mean PMTUD? MPTUD, that should say PMTUD.
Yeah, so it could be a typo.
So we
Yeah.
do have consensus. It just depends on what we agree that successful is. And I think it works, maybe it works 90% of the time, 80% of the time, whatever. And the reality is that success rate is too low for any protocol, any upper layer protocol that cares, and everything is going to do its own fragmentation layer at above UDP anyway. That's the reality. So it kind of doesn't really matter what this says. RC 1981 BIS is a standard that says how you do it.
It's not so much what this says, it's whether we advance it to internet standard based on that.
Yeah, but I mean, successful operationally, yeah, it depends. On the internet, maybe not, but inside your domain, it can be made super reliable.
Yeah.
The queue is closed. No. You're
After you.
Okay.
after you, yeah.
Okay. So I agree with Lorenzo that there is successful operational experience of PMTUD, at least within intranets. I had misread the typo differently, and I think that there is a valid question here, but it's maybe not the one that you meant. There's a section in the PMTUD document that talks about multicast PMTUD, and I had read that M there is talking about the multicast part. And so for that, I would say there's a valid question that perhaps not. And so maybe there's a
Useful
particular
typo then.
paragraph in there that the answer is no for, but the rest of the
Okay.
document, yes.
Okay. It's a handy typo then. Apart from the 2491. So where the hell are we? Right, okay, so again, and neighbor discovery is mentioned here. There's an option again to mention 6980. There's also a mention to routing header 0, which definitely should be removed. That's obviously been missed. And again, should we leave the routing header text in there, given there's type 2 and type 3 that have emerged since that? I would say we probably should leave it in there, given there are other types of routing header that have now been standardized.
I think we should, yeah, definitely leave the skeleton for routing
Yeah.
header.
But just not
Of
mention
MTU
zero.
discovery.
I think
Yeah.
that would be the action there. And I think a transport area review of 5.5, if it hasn't happened already, would be a good thing to ask for, since it talks about some quite dated now transport protocols. And there's obviously new things that have emerged in the last 10 years that someone might want to comment about there. And then finally, someone else mentioned it earlier, if you're talking about the processing of packet too big messages, should we add a note in here that if you do extension header insertion and you cause packet too big, you're actually going to send the message back to the sender rather than to the node that did the extension header insertion? Is that a warning we should put in here or leave that for elsewhere?
Just reeling and jabber questions. Julius asked, what is type 3?
It's RPL, I think.
Ripple, okay.
Answer this question, like I have no idea how to figure out who inserted the extension header. So that was like some of the things that came up, right? So the answer is the only place you can send it to is the sender.
There's a further discussion on that in the next session.
Okay.
4291, thank you.
Yeah, 4291, not 2491. Again, inconsistent use of citations and yeah, site local, maybe this discussion's been had, but it would seem intuitive to ask, should we be referencing ULAs there in the part where the site locals have been removed? Or do we just leave it saying that site locals are deprecated and not mention ULAs at all in this document? I don't think 4193 is mentioned anywhere in this document at all. Any comments on that? Okay. If anyone thinks ULAs should be mentioned, come to the mic, otherwise we'll leave them out.
Yes. So, yes,
okay.
mention ULAs.
That's just one person out of a room of 100.
In order to put ULAs into here, we might have to demonstrate successful operational use.
Thanks.
Which we would have to, like, that might involve paperwork. I'm not saying that nobody has ever used them successfully. I think no one's, but we would have to demonstrate it.
So would anyone object to removing the site local sections in 4291?
Completely.
Completely.
It seems silly to have a note saying they've been deprecated for 5 years, but we're still going to tell you about them.
Yeah.
So,
So I think as it is not, doesn't feel right. We need to do something.
So no objections to removing them in this room?
And therefore not adding ULA. Is that what you're implying?
No, I didn't say at all. But it's easier to remove unused features. Adding new features is harder.
Yeah.
In this document.
So what's your advice on ULAs in this context?
Yeah,
Okay.
currently I don't have one, but I
Okay,
should.
so
I
by
think we should
default,
take that
we
to the
will
list. Yeah.
Yeah, by default, you wouldn't add it in if there's no one saying, one person saying you should.
Can you state your name?
This is Alex Petrescu. So if this is a debatable issue, then just put a may, right? Or may
Okay,
or a
let's
may.
add it to the issue tracker anyway. I will give the action then and we can resolve it that way. Mark it as unresolved. On page 11, it talks about there being no assumptions about where the boundary is with respect to 64 or otherwise. Obviously, in the last 10 years, we've maybe moved our position somewhat there, and that's why we have RFC 7421. So my view would be to put a reference to 7421 in there to state that there is kind of an implied assumption now about the 64-bit boundary. Does anyone object to adding that note? Okay, so action would be to add that reference. I think we've kind of discussed this previously. Now, there's no mention of temporary addresses when discussing additions of 4941 and the addition of 7217. Should we add it, including use of only temporary addresses? This seems tightly coupled with the discussion we started off here. I think the important thing is that whatever it says in here is consistent with whatever we agree that comes out of the first two drafts that were discussed in this session. So I think we just park this and maybe until that's agreed and then make sure this is consistent with that would be my default suggestion. Seems that that's okay. Another thing I noticed was the updates to multicast were backed out in the previous version of this. That's 73, 71. Can someone say why that was? That seems unusual to me.
So we backed that out because we couldn't find any implementations or had no way to verify people had actually done it. So this came from the implementation report.
Okay.
So we have no proof, or I have no way to test or know, other than someone telling me they did it, that they actually implemented that RFC, which is why Bob pulled it.
So that's a good reason to back it out.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll leave it as it is then. And the last thing there is an IANA section there. Should we add the RFCs that point to the various registries in there, or should we leave that out? Default would be to leave it out, but it might be useful to add these. Any thoughts on that?
I certainly think it would have made sense to have that reference there, given that this is the main addressing architecture document.
Brian Carpenter, I'm a little bit dubious about that. And for example, you've got one there which
Under
this
revision.
version is going to be discussed in
Yeah.
a few minutes. So this is not necessarily a stable set of references. That would be my concern.
Okay.
But it's not a very big concern because we have unstable references all over the RFC corpus.
Okay.
Julius Krobacek. So I hold no opinion, but just to add a data point, I found it difficult to find the reserved IEDs document.
So adding it, you'd
were
be in
made
favor
more
of it.
visible.
Okay. All right, so the default position would be to add those, but be aware that 6890 is being discussed.
Good.
And that's it, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much for doing this work, Tim.
Okay, next one is Ole, and I think we continue similar discussion.
So this is the same topic. My name is Ole Tran. I'm standing in for Bob, trying to do a summary of what changes we've done to the BIS documents. The plan stays the same. We have a set of standards that we're going to reclassify unchanged. We have 3 documents now that require updates, and the next phase is then to look at the other set of proposed standard documents. We started off with the draft standard documents, and there's currently work on the node requirements document already underway. The updated documents are 2460, 4291, and 1981, as Tim explained earlier. The ready to advance documents is 3596 and 4443. We had a discussion about, so 4941 was in this list. We had a discussion on the mailing list, and we came to the conclusion that we could not include 4941 because there was a disagreement of if privacy addresses could stay on their own or not. I think there's no consensus on that in this room, and that's why that document is not on the list. Any further comments on that? Good. So the changes since last IETF in Buenos Aires. As I said, we removed 4941 from the core set. We initiated a working group last call that ran from May 30th indefinitely until we resolved all the issues, as we usually do with working group last calls in 6-man. We put the issues on the issue tracker as we learned them. From Tim's review of these 3 documents, I expect there to be a few more issues added. So there will be a new revision posted when Bob's back from his sailing expedition, and then we'll run, I expect, a short last call again on the 3 documents. So 4291, the changes there are we replace the reference to the default IID document with the recommended address generation mechanisms and to the privacy analysis document. So here's the actual text. In red is replacement text, in green is new text. So scream now or forever hold your peace if you disagree with this change in the latest 4291 revision. So previously, it referenced 4941 and the default IID document, and we think it's cleaner to reference the 7217 document directly, because then they're 2 equal mechanisms to generate IIDs. or examples of how you can generate IIDs. And then we added a reference to the security and privacy considerations. You weren't at the mic and I couldn't hear that, so I guess it doesn't count. Thank you, Marissa. Right, so that's all there is in the issue tracker for 4291 at the moment. Then we'll add what Tim had. For 1981, there is one issue that, let's see, that I added to the tracker, and I think it was based on, that text was based on a comment from Dave Taylor. I think it is referring to the ND proxy text, but it's not necessarily clear if you read the document. So we added this, the text regardless of whether it decrements the hop limit or not. And I thought perhaps my personal opinion was that, do people actually understand what kind of devices we're thinking of here, or does that sentence actually make sense? If no one else thinks this is a bit ambiguous, then I'll just close the issue and leave the text as is. So this is your chance to stand up and say something about that, or if you're happy with this text, it will be there. Okay, good. Then I'll just close that issue. Excellent. 2460 bis. We updated a reference. We changed the text on header injection, and we changed a should from, so 2460 has a must, 7045 has a should, and 2460 now bis has a may. And I guess the next step is to just remove the text altogether. So those are there are only those two tickets open: hop by hop header handling and header injection, plus now what we'll get from Tim's review. So the header injection issue has been discussed quite a lot. I don't want to recap and reiterate that whole discussion, so I think we will try to limit ourselves to the proposed consensus text that we have, unless you have some new issues to bring up. And we're certainly not going to design how header injection would or would not work in 2460 bits. That's completely out of scope for the document. So here is the consensus proposed text that seemed to reach consensus. It is based on a message that Brian Carpenter found from Steve Deering back in '95, I think, when someone else raised this issue, and he said, well, this is what will break, and that is essentially this text that is here now, and that goes in the section below extension headers. If there are no objections to this, then this is the text that will go. It looks like there might be some comments. Fernando.
So from what I read from there, so that the current approach to allowing a header to be inserted is to tunnel, right? So
yes.
So then you're not allowing extension headers to be inserted, because that's tunneling. That's not inserting a header.
Insert on the inside and then encapsulate.
This document is not trying to explain how you would do header insertion.
So let's put
typically, if you want to add more information to a packet, the current approach we had for that is encapsulation.
So let's put things in a different way. I don't care about the outcome, whether it is to allow or not to allow, but I think that should be clear. I mean, if we're doing a BIS document, that should be clear. I don't care about whether the end result is to allowing or not to allowing. There might be reasons, for example, to allow the insertion of extension headers. That's fine. But I think this document, being a BIS document, should be clear on that. And currently, I don't think it is.
You don't think this text is clear?
Can I insert, let's say I'm a router, a packet is passing through my device. Can I insert an extension header in there or not?
No. That will break what says it's stated in that paragraph.
Well, but the thing is, if I insert an extension header, am I compliant with 2460 bis or not?
No.
But what about 2460 bis? Because it's not, it doesn't say you are not allowed to insert or you are allowed to insert. It's like, so what I like to see is a clear statement. It is allowed to insert extension headers or it is not. I don't care about the outcome, but I think that should be clear.
So, you know, Brian.
Brian Carpenter. There is some text in there which is not here, which is the old sentence that still exists, saying that extension headers are not processed by intermediate systems, except for the hop-by-hop case.
Absolutely.
And the argument has always been about what the word processed meant. I believe that processed means processed in the sense of inserting, deleting, changing, or doing anything with, because it's not your business. So, but there are other people who have interpreted processed in a much more vague way. I personally would prefer if the word processed was expanded to say inserted, created, or changed, right? So I'm actually with Fernando asking for it to be more black and white, but that's not in this text. It's one paragraph up, I think, in the document. But if we're content to leave the ambiguity of interpretation of the word processed in the document, we're fine as we are, but we will continue to have the argument every couple of IETFs. So I would personally advocate for being more precise, but it isn't in this text, it's in the paragraph that uses that word processed.
So I think, just to reply to that, I think process is very clearly stated in, you know, what is the context for process, and there's always a statement prior to that, and you know the general statement is that if you're a router, you never look beyond 40 bytes, with one exception, and the exception is the hop-by-hop header, and only that. And of course, the problem we have, I think, is that over the last 20 years, everyone violates that general statement, right? But in the context of 2460 bits, that is the statement that applies. The routers do not examine or process anything beyond 40 bytes, with one exception.
Okay, just a housekeeping. In interest of time, in next 5 seconds, we will close the queue. If anyone wants to say anything, go up. And it was Mark.
That was my timer. Mark Townsley. Yes to the first paragraph. It's a fact. It's an observable fact. It's information. We can get into the philosophical discussion of whether or not, like Dave was saying, PMTU is actually useful in one little network. It doesn't really work across the internet anyway. But, you know, that's a separate discussion. The first paragraph is a fact, good information. The second paragraph I would like to have deleted for 2 reasons. One, it's doing exactly what you said you didn't want to do. Design how to do header insertion, okay? So you just contradicted yourself. And the second reason, it's not supported by the evidence. The current approach to allow a header to be inserted, I know of at least 2. One that's designed there in 2460, and the other that's in the segment routing draft, about where you insert and then you delete when you leave the domain. That's at least 2. There might be more, okay? So it's completely false, the second paragraph. Delete it, leave the first one, and we're done. Thumbs up, keep moving forward.
Would you be unhappy? Because the goal here is, for consensus, is that everyone is equally unhappy and pissed off. So
well, I'm unhappy about number 2 because it's false. And it's you should be unhappy because you just contradicted yourself.
But I'm unhappy generally. I'm a Scandinavian, but
anyway, there you go.
Yeah.
Yes to 1, no to 2.
Okay. At least the minutes, can you reflect that comment on the text?
Current approach, objection, Your Honor, conjecture.
So we have the second paragraph saying about the current approach, but then if we're talking about the current approach, and Andrei Yurchenko, we should have an explicit mention talking about future-proofness, and that would allow some future approaches to be defined. Or we should delete that second paragraph.
Jelenkova, I agree with Mark. First paragraph is good. Second one, we still do not say should not, must, or must not. We actually do not add anything, right? We just say a current approach. Can I do something else or cannot? It's not clear to me. It was not clearly defined in the original RFC. So again, I'm against adding additional restrictions which were not in the original text. So I think the first paragraph is good. Second, we should delete.
So just, does anyone have arguments to keep the second paragraph? Are there any, okay, go.
Michael Richardson. I don't like this text, and I understand why some people who stood up here are confused about the yes/no question. So let me suggest slightly different wording and see if it makes people happier.
We should
An approach to allowing a header to be added is to encapsulate the packet using another IPv6 search. The reason I take out the word inserted is I think that confuses people, because so I put an IP header in front of it, and now I can put a new header in somewhere else, anywhere, wherever I like. Okay, that's I think maybe what confuses people. Okay, so if you to change it, well, no, it doesn't say where the new header goes after the first header. For example, you could put it after the first header, or after the second header, or after the, for example. Okay, so that's why. So you may want to. Okay. So as for it being conjecture, okay, you're probably right. There's probably no one doing it. It is what we're trying to specify in the role working group. We do have a big concern, which is that we think that if we spray packets that say destination, a packet that started as source address Ole, destination Lorenzo, gets to me, I add source address Michael, destination Lorenzo, inside packet is the original packet, that Lorenzo's going to drop it because he's going to go, I don't remember a tunnel configured with Michael. Okay, most end hosts are going to go, whoa, what's this? And they're going to drop it. So that's why actually this current approach probably doesn't work on the wide open internet. And I would be happy with it saying an approach and, being very vague about it, or future work, or
you would
whatever.
Prefer to keep the
I would
paragraph.
prefer to keep something that says, that basically keeps people from going, oh, we have no way of doing this. Like, no, you might be able to do this, but you'll have to go think about it.
But why would you mind if there was no way of doing it in 2460? No one is we lived with 2460 for 20 years.
Because the rules of other things require it in role. We absolutely need to do this.
Right, but you can specify it in your document.
Okay. So, but you're not forbidding people from doing this.
Right.
Okay. So you're just not saying anything.
I want something that is future-proof and testable and interoperable and implemented, right? And this is clearly not implemented in a 2460 context. So
I don't object to removing, but I think maybe better text might make people happier with having it. That's, I guess, really what I wanted to say. I think that this paragraph, as written, is wrong.
Yeah.
And I agree with all the reasons why it's wrong.
Yeah. One example of, or
one example, or an approach, or blah, 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 but actually, and remove the word for example.
Yeah.
Okay, Lorenzo is lost in the queue. It's closed now.
Tim Chan, so I'm happy with, I would quite like to see the second paragraph removed, given that the first paragraph is factual and is a health warning that makes it very clear as to what the consequences are.
Yeah.
The one thing I would say is I'm with Brian, and the fact that we do say earlier on, process and examine, and imply that examine isn't a form of processing, which is a bit weird. So I would be for maybe clarifying processing, but I realize that's a bit of a rat hole as well, because then how do you define processing without saying added and inserting? I think it's vague at the moment between examine and processing.
Right.
John Brzezowski. Just for the record, I think Mark said it quite well. I'd like to agree with him, and probably most others have said so far. You should just take out the second paragraph. I mean, it is encouraging. I think the guy, there's two in front of it, Michael, I guess it is. I don't know where he went. Yeah, I think interesting comment he made about maybe clarifying it, but you not objecting to it. That was encouraging. So I mean, but for the record, I fully agree with kind of the direction that Mark took it in. So.
So discussion, not commenting about this thing, but like specifically about something Brian said. If, like, I personally don't want to expand processing, but if you expand processing, make sure that the text that comes out like allows for what the routing header does. Okay, so if we can, because like routing header is an extension header, and it's a router processing it, but it's a destination address, like the swap happens. So make sure like whatever like we craft like works for that too.
Yeah, it makes me a little scared putting my fingers into that. Yeah.
Fernando, when we were discussing this on the mailing list, I think that much of the discussion had to do with was in RFC 2460. Okay, So there was some people that was reading it as, the insertion of extension headers not being forbidden. Other people assuming that, well, it wasn't explicitly forbidden because it wasn't like allowed. I mean, nobody was expecting like immutables to insert. So my question essentially that remains unanswered is like two different questions. The first one is, if there is a box that inserts an extension header, is that compliant with 2460? Yes or no?
So most boxes on the internet today are not compliant with 2460.
Then how are we moving this to internet standard?
They violate, they look way into the packet, right? They violate that general.
Yeah, but in this case, we are modifying the packet on the fly. Again, I'm not saying you shouldn't do this. What I'm saying is that it should be clear whether we allow it or we don't, and what breaks if we allow it. So I think this is like, it's a BIS document. So we shouldn't have this discussion again regarding, whether this is allowed or not. And it shouldn't require like a lot of discussion to be able to tell, yeah, if you are a box, you can insert a header there or you cannot. I don't care about the outcome. But I think that it's not nice that, we have had this lengthy discussion and, we still cannot, say, well, yeah, clearly it is allowed or clearly it's not allowed. So
clearly it's not specified how to do it. So someone would have to specify how to do it if they wanted to get it into a standard.
So you mean that it is allowed because you are saying that they should specify how to do it. It means that it's allowed.
The IETF creates specifications for how to make interoperable implementations. We're not a body that says what's allowed and not allowed.
Well, what are the must about then?
Interoperability. So have this created interoperability problems? 2460 text, and as far as I know, no.
When it says that the errors can be misdirected, isn't that like an potential interoperability problem? Yeah. Well, apparently, yes. I mean, we have a spec for that.
Yeah. But I understand your point.
So the thing is that MTU discovery might break, but we don't care if it breaks, if I read the comments correctly.
The only text, looking at the first paragraph, it says it breaks, right? That's a factual statement that if you were to change the size of the packet,
and we are okay with that.
It's a fact, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Eric Nordmark. So I think so the first paragraph is factually correct, but if we take sort of future-proofing this and trying to think about someone reading this document 10 years from now, maybe they would want a bit more background. So I think some things along the lines of what Michael was suggesting with the second paragraph, which is not about current approach, it is about something that we know actually avoids the issue above, and it's specifically about the issue above. Right. Yeah. So this issue can be avoided by encapsulating. That doesn't mean that there are other ways of avoiding it, or the fact that some people don't care about PathMQ discovery or whatever. Right. Yeah. That still is factually correct that you can avoid this. One way to avoid it is to do this. Yeah. And that provides a bit more information for someone that comes around in the future and reading this document. Right. Yeah. So it still doesn't address is it allowed or not? But I don't think we need to worry about that for the interoperability reason, right? So we can have other specs that update this stuff saying that in this context, we do this, and this is how we handle PathMQ discovery or other operational issues, right? And that's a separate document and a separate working group. That's fine. So.
Lorenzo Corredi, I think the first paragraph needs to be expanded though, because if we have some box in the middle that just inserts one like whatever amount of crap in the middle of the packet and the destination crashes, that's bad for interoperability, right? That's fundamentally broken. So I think if we do, so my personal opinion is that we're completely inversing the sense of this 2460, which basically forbids this. Now, if we're saying that that's anachronistic and we're changing, and that's fine, but we do have to say it's not just PMTUD that it breaks. It could break like unknown, unspecified other crap. So what we should do is we should say something here that if you insert, you must remove it before it gets to the destination.
But then you're designing the mechanism, and
well, then we have to at least put a health warning that say if you insert something, you might crash the destination. You shouldn't do that. No, like well, there's is that evidence sufficient to say that those problems don't exist? You might say that they're not widespread.
I'm using the spare 5 minutes. Spare 5 minutes.
Well, but we are making the case that we're removing an existing prohibition. So we're basically removing something that was forbidden before. No, it was not ambiguous. You can't add an extension header without processing it.
So this text, the first paragraph is not removing anything, as far as I can see.
That's
It
right.
just states that.
Well, but there was text in RFC 2460 before that said that intermediate nodes don't process, and that text is gone.
That text is still there.
Okay.
That's what Brian was referring to.
I see. So that's still there. Okay.
We should probably move on.
Yeah, we're running very short on time. I think we still have to take this issue on the list. But so Michael, Mark, and if you wanted the second paragraph, can you find some compromise where you're equally unhappy on the second paragraph if you want to keep it?
Yeah, since I'm responding to a direct question, and Michael, yes, I think that, if there's consensus that we need the second paragraph, okay, otherwise it's too much of a hole. If we tie it to the first one and say something like, one approach that, doesn't break PMTU or send the packet back to the source of the packet that didn't insert the header, is to encapsulate. Now, you're still contradicting yourself because you said you didn't want to design it, but it might be obvious enough that it fits in here, and it gives, here's one way that doesn't break it, but we need to leave it open because we need to allow for the other options, I think.
So,
what? It breaks it differently. Exactly. You might want it to come back to the original source. Yeah, yeah, maybe we won't get there. I'm not thinking about Frank's case.
Okay, so
I think I'm flipping back to delete it. I'm not sure. I think I like delete it better now.
the perfect deletion is 2460 saying nothing about it, right? But people are unhappy.
It's back to the first thing you said. We're not going to design this in here. And then I got tempted. I was like, maybe we can. And well, maybe we can't. Right? It's too soon.
Yeah. That's my alarm going off. So we really need to close this at some point. We can't.
4 minutes left.
Stretching this one forever, but we have to take it to the list clearly, and we have to file on this text a little bit more. So one more issue, the hop-by-hop header. So this is triggered by work that Fred Baker did in a hop-by-hop, his hop-by-hop draft, and this is the one change that now makes hop-by-hop processing by intermediate nodes a may. And we added a note saying that nodes have to be explicitly configured to examine or process the hop-by-hop option header. The hop-by-hop option header is really undeployable on the general internet and will be, has been discussions about, deprecating it completely. I think Michael has uses for it, but it will be within contained domains. Michael
Richardson. So I thought, and as I wrote this this morning, I guess, further down in the text, I thought we were going to remove the criticality bits from the hop-by-hop header. And I think that when in the end we decided such that it didn't matter if you didn't understand the header, you would just skip it over anywhere. But I think that what we did is we decided that the whole header is non-critical. Unless you've been told to look at it, you won't look at it. What I am worried about is, though, about deployability, and that comes back to if a node has been told to look at them, then should it still observe the criticality bits? Right. Okay, and I think we should say no, that we should still deprecate those bits.
So my opinion there is yes, we should adhere to those bits. There were a mechanism to signal intention of them were the ability to signal
Right.
that every node on the path needs to support these. I do see the duality here,
Right.
of course, but
You can't use it because because you want to know if it's not going to be respected, because if it's not being respected, then I'll do something else.
the consequence of this, or really the consequence of the mandatory bits to start with, is that you can't really specify new options with the mandatory flags, right?
Right, and I happen to be stuck with an option that has been specified with the mandatory flag, specifically so that the internet will drop packets that we leaked.
Oh, but
Okay.
oh, interesting. But
Okay, but it turns out this forces us to do a whole bunch of games to put an IP header in to encapsulate, because we have to remove that when we actually did want to do cross the internet.
so you're saying that inside your domain you have some routers that support the options, some routers that don't support the options, and the don't supporting option ones should still forward it? Because then you're violating the text quite.
Inside my domain, I have potentially have leafs, which are v6 nodes that are at the edge of my domain. When they send packets into my domain, I will add an IP header and my special routing headers, okay? And now I have to figure out where to remove them. And the specific problem I wind up with is that I don't know, on the other side of my domain, am I speaking to a node that knows the hop-by-hop headers or one that does not?
But why did you make them mandatory in the first place if they aren't?
Actually, that's one of my arguments for going back to 2010 and like, why did you guys do this? This was dumb. Why did you do that? It was dumb to have made them mandatory. The idea was to make them, to cause the internet to drop these things, because we shouldn't be leaking them, was the idea. Well, the answer is, well, we actually want to communicate with the internet. It's just not everyone wants to do that.
I have 6 nanoseconds per packet. I'm not going to look at your.
I don't want you to look at them.
And decide to
I don't want you to look at them. And this green text, because it says all nodes, not all routers, which is good, okay, means that you won't look at them, which is great. But I also don't want the end host stack to drop them because they showed up. That's what I would like. And I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that many implementations just they ignore them. You're done.
So can you live with this text? you think?
I can live with this text. I'm happy with this text. This is good text. I would like to deprecate the criticality bits as well, okay? But it's more because I'm anxious that somebody will enable hop-by-hop processing for a legitimate reason in their end host, and will then pay attention to criticality bits and will shoot themselves in the foot as a result. So I would rather have text that I can point them at that says, and when you enable it, you really only want to look at the ones you care about, and the rest of them, green text should apply.
Yeah, and that might be a too large a change to get into 2460, I guess.
Okay, so I can live it as it is. I also just want to bring the room, I did post another email this morning with a link with a diff that basically says how our document that explains how to use IP headers and our other extensions and when you must use them, how it changes as the result of mostly this change.
Yeah.
Okay, specifically, we think we probably save in one of the modes of operation for Ripple, we probably eliminate almost all the IP headers, and therefore it probably 3 to 10 bytes per every packet.
Oh, so you are
after compression.
You are very supportive.
We're very supportive. This in the storing case eliminates a whole bunch of IP headers, not all of them, but a whole bunch. Okay.
Okay, we are minus
and
2
we
minutes.
And we don't have to do link layer hop by hop headers. Sorry, put an IP in on each hop across, because that's what we're faced with. And it sounds gross, it is.
So we have, yeah, thank you. We have to move on. I'll just let the 3 speakers speak.
Minus 2 minutes, yeah. So we're closing the queue. Whoever's in the queue can talk. Fred.
Well, I was a little bit surprised that you even put this up, because I thought we had killed this or closed it. But where we came to in between you and Bob and Ron and I on the hop by hop draft was that we would examine and process hop by hop options header, comma, and specific options in it, comma, if explicitly configured to do so. Do we actually want to have that discussion? What are we doing here?
I'm not sure I get the distinction. So what is?
Well, the header contains options.
Right.
And the thing that we were saying in that draft was that we would only process the options header if we knew of a particular option that might be in it that we cared about, and we would configure the processing of that option or that set of options.
Right. So
So there's
right. So I think
comma stuff, comma
right
in that last sentence.
So this text keeps the hop by hop processing the same, as 2460.
Well-
and I think Bob and my conclusion were that
Which makes you have to look at every option, not just the ones that you were configuring.
if you were configured to look at the header at all, yes. But you kind of have
That's
to.
not where we came to.
You have to do that anyway if you want to find the option, right? So at least you have to parse the packet or parse the option header.
You have to if you're going to parse the option header, you have to parse the option header. I agree.
But if an implementation wanted to cherry pick options,
Which was where we came to in the hop by hop options draft.
so if you can find some way of.
Are we
Yeah.
actually having that discussion, or did
We
can the whole
probably
thing?
don't have time
No.
for that discussion now.
Okay.
So Krishnan, very short point. Like I understand what Michael says, but I don't really agree because the criticality needs to be respected for at least one stuff. Like I've written code for it, but I'm not sure if it's ever used. That's jumbogram. So you're gonna have a datagram size of 0, and until you process the option, like you don't know what's in the packet. So I don't want that in there. So we need to fix that. Like so criticality needs to be there. If you process an option, so I agree with Fred as well. So if you have configured to process an option and you process it and it's critical, you need to handle it. We cannot ignore it.
Frank?
Yeah, I also think that we should go and further refine that tax because what is not clear to me is what process means. Because ignoring is also processing. Oh, I'm Frank Wagner, sorry. Should have said that. So I think ignoring is also processing, and we should absolutely make sure that we can ignore without explicitly configuring to ignore.
Well, the default here is to ignore the hop by hop header.
Yeah, but I don't want to break a system by putting an extension header on, which is in cases happening today.
Do you have text to propose? Then please send it to
as
the
I
main-
said, well, let's take that into another
Okay.
cycle.
Yeah.
Okay.
Done. And yes, we have Brian and Brian.
No, next steps?
Oh, we have next steps. Yes. We have to solve out these issues on the main list.
Okay, Brian?
And I stand in the pink box.
You have to stand in the pink box.
Yes.
Don't jump around.
All right, so you get one Brian, and the other Brian will jump up if anybody actually complains about something he wants to talk about. I'm going to try and make this real quick. For those of you who are aware, we wrote RFC 6890, I believe it was about a year and a half ago, to try and clean up a lot of the special use address registries that IANA maintains. And it turns out that we may have made a slight mistake. And this all comes about because of the way people use the term global. It turns out that in RFC 6890, the way we talked about it was essentially globally reachable, which meant it would be advertised in the global routing tables all over the place. And Brian Carpenter came up with some code using a Python module, and they kind of interpreted that global to mean something else. The big thing here is that it really shows up when you talk about ULAs, because when you look at the definition of ULAs in 4193, it does say that the ULA is globally scoped. It doesn't say anything about globally routable. And so what we were trying to do is fix all that. And in the process, I noticed that there was an errata against their 6890 that is actually related to this, but for the Teredo prefix. So in a nutshell, 4291 says that most of the IPv6 address space comes out of the global unicast space, and it
ULAs are drawn out of that space. And 4193 in defining ULAs says that ULAs are globally a unique prefix. And in practice, applications may treat these addresses like globally scoped addresses. However, 6890 defines the term global in terms of forwarding. And by doing that, we put in that global equals false and forwardable equals true for ULAs. So it turned out that the errata filed for the Teredo prefix had something similar, and it was probably due to the way the global was defined. And so essentially what I'm trying to do with this document is fix that definition of global in order to make things a little more consistent. So what I've put in as proposed changes in the 00 draft is essentially change that column name from just global to globally reachable to be a little more clear in what we were trying to define. So even though an address may be globally scoped, it may not be globally reachable. And it should potentially clear up the conflict that caused Brian to run into the problem with the code. Michael?
Yeah, Michael Abramson. So does this then match the labels in RFC 6724 for source address selection? Because I was actually, there was no mention of that. And isn't this aren't these problems kind of touching each other?
So when 6890 was being defined, there was no intent on trying to match it with the address selection table, because these registries are essentially just to define or document the prefixes that have been allocated for special use. And so they're not trying to touch what the address selection document may be trying to do.
Okay. Aren't, in reality, like when you actually try to implement, aren't these problems fairly closely related? Like, when it's globally reachable, don't you want to have that in the same label in 6724 terms?
Yeah, Brian, my answer is no, because ULAs are different. ULAs have a specific position in 6724.
That's exactly my point. ULAs are in a different label in 6724. So, but isn't this like your kind of these false global reachable and so on? The result of that then ends up as them in being different labels in 6724. So you're kind of, okay, I don't know, but I kind of feel that these are addressing the same problem space, and that this should be, I don't know.
So I don't think they address the same problem space, because this is documentation to back up what IANA keeps in its registries for special uses.
Okay.
It's not tied specifically to how a host uses them.
Okay.
Right. So and well, I think the big thing here is that there is a relationship. The question is the address selection RFCs are a smaller scope than what this document covers. And so anything that would be changed, I think would need to be within the context of this working group. This is a little bit broader than this working group.
The queue is closed after Jeff.
Dave Taylor, maybe not a big deal, but is there a reason you didn't use globally routable, which I think might be clear?
No. And if somebody thinks, if we had consensus on routable versus reachable, I know there's some loaded terminology there that we have to be careful of, and reachable seemed to be a little more clear in what we were trying to do. James?
James Woodyard, Nest Labs, and Alex, this comment that was just to my right is pretty much the same one I stood up to make, which is that I'm a little confused about why globally and globally reachable is something that we're talking about with ULAs, because my understanding, and it seems clear to me, so this is a question, why isn't this clear to everyone else, is that
ULAs have global scope, period. This is not difficult to comprehend, but what makes them different from everything else, and that's why they're in the source address selection algorithm as having a special label, isn't their scope, but their routability. They are not publicly routed. So I don't like the idea of marking ULAs as globally reachable equals false, because they really are global scoped. They can be reached anywhere in the world. What they aren't is publicly routed. And that sounds like the distinction that is what we're searching for with this update, is that we want these special use addresses to apply to global scope. But ULAs there's this other quality that isn't about the scope of the address, but it's the routability of the address. And specifically whether it's routed within the public routing tables. And I think that word public is the part that's, why isn't this obvious to everyone else?
So I could take a crack at answering that, but I want to give Jeff an answer or an option.
I just want to add on what James said.
Name?
I agree. Pierre Pfister, Cisco. I agree with him. When you buy a router, I think you don't want the router to make a difference between a ULA and a globally reachable address. Although I understand that there is an ambiguity. So if it's just a clarification thing, shouldn't it be like an errata or instead of an update? No? Okay, no.
Jeff Houston. I work for one of the RIRs, APNIC, and my comment comes from that background. The antecedents of this document, I think, is RFC 4273, which I wrote. The reason why I wrote it was at the time we had two ways, when ULAs came along, of distributing internet number resources. We had a mechanism where IANA outsourced the distribution of IP addresses and AS numbers, which had certain properties, to the regional internet registries. The regional internet registries never insisted that the addresses they handed out were routed in a public, the internet routing system. You could do whatever you wanted with them, but if you wanted an address that was, and the terminology we used at the time, globally unique, that was what we achieved for IANA. Now, there was a different scope of addresses at the time. We called them private, net 10, blah, blah, blah. ULAs came along, and the distinction we were making in that document was between these globally unique versus some degree of scoped, thank you very much, some degree of scoped use. And that's the distinction. Now, the RIRs still believe that's the case. And we believe IANA believes that's the case. And so the distinction is whether these identifiers, these number tokens, these addresses, are unique in a global context, in which case the RIRs are doing that distribution function for us all, or there is some degree of implicit scope limitation in terms of its uniqueness property. So it's not about routable, not routable. That's irrelevant. It's actually about this issue of what scope are we talking about. And IANA and the IETF kind of agreed with ULAs because they weren't globally unique and had the same properties as normal unicast addresses in V6. It was kind of a roll your own approach, and that's why they're in that registry. If you change the classification, it begs the question, why aren't these addresses normal unicast addresses and you use the standard RIR distribution mechanism? And that's really the heart of all this. So it's not about routable, realistically. It's actually about the implicit properties of that address and its scope of uniqueness and the mechanisms that IANA used to distribute those addresses and the subtle differences we have. So does that help you? Well, I'm not sure this is an issue about routing, or even an issue about reachable. It's an issue about the scope of uniqueness. Yes, assured global uniqueness is really what's going on here.
And so back when we were doing the 6890 documentation, and I'm sure you're aware that both Leo and Michelle were involved in this because we were trying to help them clean this registry up. ULA.
4273 started out with one set of words, and then it became another one, and
Right.
it became another one, and it became another one, and the words kind of got lost in the process. You ended up with
We need to move
words
on.
that didn't really express the clear intent.
You're 1 minute.
So Barbara, is this really short one because the queue was closed? Okay. Please move on. We have another slide.
Okay, so these are the changes that we captured in this revision to try and update 6890, trying to minimize the impact. And essentially, this is where I'm going to ask for people in this room who have an interest in this work to kind of follow along with what's going on. But this document actually spans far more than just 6-man, because it does deal with both the V4 and the V6 special use registries. So my intent is to find a good home for it, either as an AD sponsored document, or most likely talking about it in the int area where we can have a little more flexibility in discussing both V4 and V6 registry issues. So I'm going to ignore that last bullet there because I think we had enough. So please, if you have an interest in this area, help us edit this document and make it as useful as possible. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brian. And we'll have a lightning talk in the end by Jen. 5 minutes.
There is Eric on.
Just a quick question, Brian. Is this on the int area agenda this week?
No.
Yes. Thank you. Oh.
Nice. So we have 44 pages draft, a lot of slides, and 4 minutes. So it's going to be just FYI, because we're going to discuss it in V6 ops and routing worker group. So more details will be there. So just to let you know, we're trying to solve the problem of multi-homing without using all these horrible things called translation. And the main problem is how can if everything works, that's fine. What I'm doing if my uplink went down, and what I'm doing when uplink is recovering, and so on. So, okay, so we make some assumptions about how it's going to work, and we're trying to cover most of the topologies, not just 2 internet uplinks, because it might be actually more tricky. You might want to access some services from ISPB, from those addresses, and the rest of internet from other set of addresses, and so on. So first part of the solution is the network. How can we route packets based on the source address? And it's apparently called source address dependent routing. And the idea is basically create a scoped forwarding table per ISP. So you have one forwarding table scope to this particular source, another scope table for another source, and you basically forward packets looking at the source, looking at the forwarding table, and you might have unscoped forwarding table, which is basically scoped to any address. The good thing is, if you can get rid of the unscoped forwarding table, you get in BCP38 automatically, because you cannot forward some random source addresses. So yeah, something like that. And you can incremental deploy that stuff, but it's all boring. Most interesting part is how can I tell host which address to use? Because sometimes you cannot forward particular source address because, for example, uplink went down and there is no way to forward a packet from the source. So we're looking at the source address selection algorithm, and there are some rules which are of interest. One of them is don't use deprecated address if you could avoid. And second one is rule 5.5. If you have 2 next hops and one next hop advertise you one prefix and another next hop gave you another prefix, choose the prefix advertised by next hop. So let's remember this for a second. So there is something about matching labels. So it was some ideas about can we use DHCP to do some things with labels. And we look at this, potentially yes, but there are a lot of problems which make this solution undesirable, because DHCP v6 might not be supported. There is a scalability issue. How can I reconfigure all my hosts when my uplink went down? And actually, DHCP server might be somewhere far away in the data center. I don't know how that server is going to talk to my hosts when uplink is down. So there is a better solution. Let's look at arrays. We might invent in long term some way to bind source and destination and send it through additional array options, but it's going to take time and we need to modify host, right? So how it works currently? Router sends you some arrays with some prefix information options, and host somehow picks up a source address. So how can I make sure it works if I have two scoped forwarding tables? Can we use rule 5.5 and make my router pretend to be two different routers or three different routers? It depends how many uplinks I have. So basically send one array per scope with particular prefixes from that scope. 1 minute. Okay, great. So, and yeah, I have slides uploaded. You can look on all different scenarios. What's happened when uplink went down, when uplink comes back up. What actually happens if both uplinks went down and I do not have any addresses anymore. One of the solutions might be actually introduce another scope for ULAs. So Lawrence, we might have actually a use case for ULAs. And you can use them for intra-site communication. So if you change your ISP, you don't need to renumber the whole infrastructure, which I think is nice. And yeah, you can also tell host by ICMPv6 that your source address is wrong, but it's not scalable because routers do have some rate limitings for ICMP and so on. And yeah, again, you can incrementally deploy source address dependent routing. And if your host is nice enough to implement two standard RFCs, then you don't need to do anything with the host. It will just work if you have source address dependent enabled router. So at least for some hosts, we do not have to change anything to make multi-homing on PA addresses work. And again, more discussions will be in routing and V6 ops because I have half an hour and not 4 minutes.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jen.
Thank you.
And I think we're done for this IETF. We tried a slightly different format by giving a lot more discussion time this time than we've done previously. Feedback on that. So there's a few thumbs up. Okay, good. That means we have less stuff on the agenda and more discussion time. At least that's what we can aim for. Good. See you in somewhere. Seoul. Yes.
Thank you.
And please send the last blue sheet up to the chairs, please.